Hey everybody, good afternoon and welcome to another incredibly exciting webcast from Universal Peace Federation. Today we have some top analysts who have amassed tremendous credentials in understanding and experience in understanding the workings of the DPRK and what's going on now. I'm going to begin by introducing our moderator, Dr. Michael Jenkins, who is president of the Washington Times Foundation and president of Universal Peace Federation North America, and also chairman of Washington Times Holdings, the owners of the Washington Times News Organization. He is the director of the Northeast Asia Peace Initiative and the Middle East Peace Initiative, which have both worked since the 1980s on conflict resolution projects around the Pacific Rim and in Israel and Palestine. Welcome, Dr. Jenkins.
Thank you, Larry. It's an honor to be with you and with all of our guests online today, both on YouTube and also here on our Zoom call. We have world-renowned Korean analysts that will discuss the DPRK's internal reshuffle of senior officials, tightening sanctions, COVID, and how the Biden and Moon administrations can strengthen the US-ROK alliance to counter Pyongyang's growing nuclear and missile threats, and what China, Japan, and Russia can do to facilitate North Korea's denuclearization and Northeast Asian stability. We have three distinguished panelists today: Dr. Joseph Bermudez Jr., Dr. Bruce Bechtol Jr., and Dr. Alexander Manzaroff, and I'll be introducing them each one by one. For our first speaker today is Dr. Joseph Bermudez Jr., who is an internationally recognized analyst, award-winning author, and lecturer of North Korean defense and intelligence affairs and ballistic missile development in developing countries. He is concurrently Senior Fellow for Imagery and Analysis at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, CSIS, Senior Advisor of Imagery Analysis for the Committee for Human Rights in North Korea. And he's author of IHS Market, formerly Jane's Information Group, and publisher and editor of the KPA Journal, the Journal of North Korean Defense and Intelligence Affairs. He's authored many books, and we're going to present the cover to that book right now that he's also recently authored. If you could bring that up. The Armed Forces of Korea. We want to encourage everybody to go online and get that at Amazon. And it's an excellent summary of the current situation and analysis of where we go from here. Let's welcome Dr. Joseph Bermudez. Welcome.
Good afternoon, and thank you very much. I will leave policy and international relations to both Sasha and Bruce. I've been asked to briefly give you some thoughts on looking at North Korea's ballistic missile programs. It's always a challenge, especially for those who are just beginning to understand North Korea, beginning their interest in North Korea. And there's a lot of excitement every time there's a parade. I want to just give you like 4 or 5 points to keep in mind. At these parades and in documents published by South Korea and other governments, we see a plethora of missiles and missile types and rockets, and people are duly impressed, and you should be. The parades are impressive things. However, one thing that most people don't understand is that North Korea, just like the former Soviet Union and other, command economies, has competition amongst its missile design bureaus. It's important for a design bureau in North Korea to gain access to the leadership. Then they'll have access to money, funding, and people, and their programs can continue to expand. And because of this competition, we have for many years seen different types of weapons, many different types of weapons, all of these at the parades. And what happens is we believe, and the North Koreans want us to believe, that these missile systems are in operational use. Many of them are not. Many of them are prototypes. Many of them are very limited runs, and then a design bureau falls out of favor, or the design itself fails. So we should keep that in mind. The other thing we should keep in mind is that North Korea, in designing all these systems, are not pursuing advanced technology. So if a nation today, other than North Korea, for example, France, Great Britain, Israel, the United States, when we build a missile, we want it to hit within meters of its destination. North Korea doesn't strive for that. It strives for what we call appropriate technology rather than cutting edge technology. And that's important to understand. They have a different perspective on it. They want the system in the field and that it'll launch and generally hit its target. That's a different philosophy than most Western nations, or actually any other nation who's pursuing advanced ballistic missiles. We see a lot of these missiles, rockets on parade. As I said previously, many of these have never reached operational service. One of the most interesting things is that there are other systems that we've identified in satellite imagery and elsewhere that have never, ever been shown in a parade. North Korea, when it presents something either in the media or in one of their parades, shows the world something that they want the world to see, not necessarily reality, but something they want us to see. They want us to take a message away, their message, and that message isn't necessarily the truth. They do it for a lot of political reasons, but also for practical reasons. You know, they have 20 different systems in the past 5 years. They want us to go looking for them. And when we do, we really don't find that many of them actually at the operational level. One of the other challenges when looking at North Korea's ballistic missiles at the open source level is circular verification. So saying we're watching a parade or we see an image on, in Rodong Sinmun that shows a weapon system. Well, a lot of junior analysts or people who are enthusiasts will quickly jump on it, trying to get media attention, trying to get the little clicks, in Twitter and things of that nature. And they come up with some proposed explanation for it, what they see in the image. Well, quite often that isn't quite accurate. And the fact that they've stated it becomes eventually a fact. One person will repeat it, another person will repeat it with less caution, and a third person or fourth person will repeat it as if it's fact. And then it comes into the body of facts about North Korea. So we have to be careful about that. There is a, Occam's razor. The simplest answer is normally the correct answer. And that's very true in North Korea. Another thing that people take two sides when they're looking at North Korea. They say that they're very advanced, and others say that they're not advanced at all, and all we see is, mock-ups or just, decoys. Well, the truth is somewhere in between, and it depends on the system we're discussing. But underlying this is manpower, and I'm using it in a general sense. North Korea has a system of education and selection of individuals that starts at the high school level. High school level students who have an aptitude in science and mathematics are groomed. They're sent to special colleges. Once they get past the college level, they're recruited in some of the universities or into the engineering schools. And they bring their knowledge and their experience and their training into the ballistic missile, as well as the nuclear field. They're given special benefits. They're giving, more freedom to look on the internet, things of that nature. And then they rise in status. They have no shortage of high-level scientists, designers, engineers, and for the most part, high-level technicians. It's when you get to the person on the shop floor where they have more challenges. So quality assurance and system integration present a problem with North Korea's ballistic missile forces. One only has to look at the Musudan. Musudan has suffered numerous dramatic failures over the years, yet it's still fielded. It's actually fielded in a number of North Korean missile brigades. Part of this is politics internal that we don't see too often. Part of this is the power of the design bureau, the liquid engine design bureau. And part of it is just, institutional momentum. I'll conclude with just one more item that people need to consider when assessing North Korea's ballistic missile program. That is the power of the party, the Korean Workers' Party. So you might have a fantastic missile system, rocket system, well-designed, reliable, relatively easy or centered within the manufacturing capabilities of North Korea. And it could have tremendous problems because of the party. You might have a competent manager who has an engineering degree in charge of the factory or the production line of a ballistic missile. That one, for some reason, is removed because he didn't bow to a picture of Kim Jong-un, a week ago. He's replaced by a party faithful, a person who has no real engineering experience. He looks at the warhead and says, oh, we're using 50 bolts to hold the warhead on. We could save money, and I can make myself look better by cutting that in half. Well, cutting that 50 bolts, holding the warhead on to 25 bolts affects reliability. And it actually, we see things like this happen throughout the military industrial infrastructure in North Korea. So there's a lot of things, a lot of moving parts to fit into understanding North Korea's ballistic missile forces and capabilities. And we need to keep these in proper context when we provide an overall assessment. We tend to give them a little too much credit at times. And with that, I'll pass it off. I'm sorry if I went over my time.
No, that was excellent, Joe. Thank you very much.
Most welcome.
Very interested to hear more. At this time, I'd like to present Dr. Bruce Bechtol, Jr. Bruce is an award-winning professor and political scientist at Angelo State University in Texas. He's a retired Marine, formerly on the faculty of the Marine Corps Command and Staff College and the Air Command and Staff College. Dr. Bechtol also served as an adjunct professor at the Korea University Graduate School of International Studies. He was intelligence officer for the DIA, eventually serving as senior analyst for Northeast Asia and the intelligence directorate of the Joint Staff in the Pentagon. He's currently president of the International Council on Korean Studies and serves on the board of directors of the Council of US-Korean Security Studies. He's an author of the recent book, North Korean Military Proliferation to the Middle East and Africa, Enabling Violence and Instability. He also has authored North Korean Military Proliferation in the Middle East and Africa. And we encourage everybody to get that wonderful and excellent presentation on North Korea's military proliferation. We'd like to welcome at this time Dr. Bruce Bechtol. Thank you.
Well, thank you for having me. It's quite an honor. And I just met Larry a few weeks ago, but he's been great fun to talk to, and it's nice to have a fellow Texan on the panel as well, a fellow West Texan, I should say. And Sasha and Joe are both old friends of mine. So it's nice to be here, and I really appreciate it. I'm going to talk about the follow-up to what Joe Bermudez talked about. So, I mean, your audience is people who watch the news a lot and are well-informed. So I'm sure all of you that are watching right now are well aware of the many weapons tests that North Korea has conducted. Everything except nukes and ICBMs, right? Since President Trump took over, that was basically their agreement, and the North Koreans actually lived up to an agreement, which, if you're a longtime analyst of North Korea, you know is very unusual. But We've seen them testing a lot of these systems, everything from multiple rocket launchers to short-range ballistic missiles to new radars and artillery that can hit anywhere on Camp Humphreys in South Korea, et cetera, et cetera. But I would just ask our audience today to think of this as a two-headed threat, a two-headed monster, if you will. Because North Korea, everything, not everything, but many things that they test and deploy in the field are also proliferated. So when you see, for example, Joe Bermudez brought up the Musudan, well, guess who else has the Musudan? Iran. And they've had the Musudan since 2006. And by the way, they've crashed it a lot too. So interesting stuff. Proliferation occurs all over the world, but the two primary regions, or the two most important regions, at least in my analysis, are the Middle East and Africa. So I'm going to briefly talk about the kinds of things that they sell in the Middle East to primarily Iran and Syria, but to their proxies as well. And then I'll talk about Africa. Well, you're probably leaning, all of you, into your cameras going, my God, Bruce, what kind of stuff are they proliferating? Well, I'm going to tell you. The North Korean proliferation activities include the following: WMD and the platforms that carry it, things such as chemical weapons and obviously a nuclear program, plutonium, to the Syrians, and the platforms that carry it, which for the Syrians, for example, is Scud C and D, and the multiple rocket launchers as well, 122 millimeter rocket launchers, which they were using to fire these weapons at their own people. Refurbishment of Soviet-era weapons for countries that still use them. We see that all over Africa and the Middle East, particularly during the Syrian civil war. Conventional weapon sales of every kind. I mean, up to and including even stuff like submarines and low visibility, naval craft, etc. Technical and military assistance and advising. This is done all over Africa and all over the Middle East, particularly with non-state actors, as we would call them, the Houthis, Hezbollah, etc. A key change in proliferation that has occurred since the 1990s has been that rather than selling, for example, whole missiles like we saw when it made the big press. We're all old guys, so most of us can remember back to 2003 when the North Koreans sold those Scuds to Yemen. Those Scuds were whole Scuds on a ship in crates. They rarely do that anymore. Generally, what they do now is they'll sell a system or two to a country. The system, the country likes it, and then they'll build a facility in that country where they'll actually build those systems. But you still need North Korean advisors to help run the factory, and you still need parts coming in from North Korea. It's just a lot easier to hide smaller parts than it is, to, for example, hide a Scud or a whole bunch of Scuds on a ship, on some rust bucket that's flagged with a Tanzanian flag, for example. So when people come on board the ship, instead of looking at this long crate and saying, isn't that a Scud? Then you have parts that are more scattered out. So a very smart way that they've changed. The key countries that they sell weapons to are Iran and Syria. Iran pays for much of what Syria buys. It's been that way for a long time. It includes ballistic missiles for both of them. Lots and lots of anecdotal evidence that they have supported Iran's nuclear program in the past. So if anybody wants to ask about that, I can read the evidence to you. And since 2011, really, but before then, North Korea has sold the Syrians lots and lots of chemical precursors and weapons. and been at their facilities where these things are manufactured and mated together, and the platforms that launch them, primarily Scuds, MRLs, and of course just rolling barrel bombs out of the back of helicopters. And by the way, many helicopter sorties were flown by North Koreans for the Syrian Air Force during the Syrian Civil War. And this is not a new development. North Koreans were doing this for Syria during the Bekaa Valley War that we remember back in the early 80s, during the Yom Kippur War, etc. So not new, except now they're doing it on a cash and carry basis instead of simply being subsidized by the Soviet Union, which no longer exists. In Africa, and so we have that. Before I get to Africa, just let me say, we have that. But what has happened is, because of the Syrian Civil War, it's kind of been a boon to the quote unquote military industrial complex in North Korea. So, if you fire a lot of Scuds, you need more Scuds. You use up your chemical weapons, you need more chemical weapons. You bring fighters in that are going to help you from Hezbollah, for example, and Iran. You need small arms for them. And all that stuff is flowed in there from North Korea. So it's ended up being sales to Syria, many of which are subsidized by the Iranians, have been hundreds of millions a year. Let me repeat that. In Morse code, as you knew, that would be repeat. Hundreds of millions a year for at least 10 years now. To the Iranians, it's been in the billions. So anywhere from 1.5 to 3 billion. The numbers are spongy, and it's not like the North Koreans and Iranians are letting us look at their books. But that's a year. That's annually. Let's talk about it, and I'd be happy to answer any questions about that if there are any. Let's talk about Africa real quick. Do they make as much money there as they make in the Middle East? Oh, heck no. Not even close. But they make hundreds of millions a year because they sell to so many countries in Africa. It's gotten to the point that it's not who are they selling to, but who are they not selling to. So I'm just gonna read off the list. And by the way, this is in my book, which is available on Amazon.com, Amazon.com. The list of countries is extensive that they sell stuff to, and I can tell you exactly what they're selling. But it starts off with Eritrea, moves to Ethiopia, Zimbabwe, Mozambique, Tanzania, Egypt, still, by the way, Namibia, Sudan, Uganda, Angola, the Democratic Republic of the Congo, Madagascar, and Benin, which only has an army of about 1,500 guys. So I don't know what the heck they're selling them, but there have been reports in recent months that they have. And they're selling to the bad guys, who we're calling the bad guys apparently, in Libya, which for those of you who've been following this for a long time, like Sasha and Joe, they were selling to Libya for years, and then they stopped around 2003. Well, that's picked up again now that there really is no Libya. They're just factions. They're selling to one of the factions. So they sell them stuff, and guys like their weapons because they sell them cheaper than anybody else. They still manufacture a lot of that old 1950s and 60s Soviet era stuff, which is what the African countries are using. And Syria uses a lot of that stuff too, by the way. So this has proved to be very, very profitable for the North Koreans. My good friend David Asher has said in congressional testimony, estimated that 40% of North Korea's real economy comes from illicit activities. Probably the biggest chunk of that comes from weapons proliferations and the associated activities that go with that. So this is a big and important part for North Korea's economy and a threat to the security of our friends and neighbors in places like the Middle East. And I'll just stop there.
Thank you, Bruce. It was an excellent presentation and quite serious, as we can see, and so important that our audience hears about this. We've got many experts online right now, and our audience is growing, and this certainly helps us reach to the people who really are making decisions on how to deal with North Korea. I want to thank you. Our next speaker is Dr. Alexander Manzarov. He's an adjunct professor for security studies at Edmund A. Walsh School of Foreign Service at Georgetown University. He's president and CEO of Great Falls Solutions International, senior associate at Illumina Insight, the founding member of the U.S. National Committee on North Korea, and is frequently interviewed on all different mediums of television and radio, as well as the Washington Times and other publications, not only in the United States, but throughout the world. He has also been instrumental in many of our trips to Korea with the Washington Times Fact Finders, where we take experts to Korea and meet people in intelligence and with the National Assembly and the Blue House, and work to strengthen the relationship of America and our allies there with the ROK and Japan. Dr. Manzarov, welcome. We're very honored to have you with us today.
Thank you very much, Michael, and good afternoon, everybody. Let me welcome you all to yet another excellent webinar on the recent developments in North Korea. It's my honor to address this distinguished audience again. It's a pleasure for me to see Joe and Bruce as our excellent speakers on this panel. Now, let me start by saying that it's not easy to figure out what's going on inside North Korea, to interpret its policy. Of course, there's a lot of exaggeration by outside outlets trying to stay ahead of the line, ahead of the crew, in order to keep up the high ratings. There's a lot of noise about North Korea, as Joe suggested, which really has no basis in reality. And when we do hear some signals from North Korea, we tend to misinterpret them or ignore them. And that's what I'm going to talk about today. Basically, Pyongyang cannot ignore the vortex of diplomatic activity in Northeast Asia, which we observe these days. I mean, Secretary Blinken and Austin, they went to South Korea, Japan, successful meeting in Japan. Kind of mixed record in Seoul. Again, a debacle in Alaska in the US-China meeting there. Today, the Russian foreign minister moved from Beijing to Seoul. So the North Koreans cannot ignore this, and they launched their own high-level strategic communications campaign, if you wish, by signaling the midterm policy objectives. And specifically in the past week, we received at least three messages, very high-level messages from Pyongyang, and I'd like to kind of talk a little bit about each one of them. The first one was a statement delivered by Kim Yo Jong, the dear leader's sister. I mean, it was ridiculed in the US and South Korean press. Most analysts said it was nothing significant to report. And I disagree profoundly with that. Again, Kim Yo Jong did not mean to talk about the joint military exercises which were resumed, and that's the way how her message was interpreted, that it was a North Korean response to the exercises. Nothing of the kind. It's the job of the KPA General Staff Department to talk about the exercises, not Kim Yo Jong. Essentially, Kim Yo Jong in her statement sent two messages, very significant messages to the US-ROK alliance. First, it was a message to the United States in a nod to President Trump, if you wish. Remember, she talked about the Sleepy Joe. I mean, who was the person who referred to our current president as Sleepy Joe? It was our president. So what did she say? She basically said, go back to sleep, Sleepy Joe. And if you want the United States to basically not to have sleepless nights for the next 4 years, then stay out of the Korean Peninsula. Otherwise, we'll raise hell just like we did in 2017. That was the message to the United States. Actually, basically said, don't meddle in Korean affairs, stay away. That's what they expect from the Biden administration. Number one, and that was confirmed, by the way, by the second message, which we got from the first Vice Foreign Minister, Chess, and he just a few days ago, which reiterated that North Korea will not respond to any US initiatives unless and until the United States drops its hostile policy, quote unquote, which again, we do not really believe it will ever happen, at least under this administration. So, and in the meantime, you know, what happened in the past few days when the Malaysian Supreme Court decided to extradite one of the North Korean citizen to the US on the charges brought up by the US government, which led to the North Korean decision to sever diplomatic ties with Malaysia just a couple of days ago. I mean, that was another element in that North Korean consideration that they really do not see any prospect for the improvement in the relations with the US under the Biden administration. Now, but that was the first message in Kim Yo Jongs' statement. The second message really was addressed to the Moon administration. Essentially, since even President Moon proved to be just a puppet of the United States, what she said was that they saw no reason in Pyongyang for any, they saw no prospect of any improvement in the North-South relationship. And so basically she said, we see no reason to treat the North-South relationship as special. So she indicated Pyongyang's willingness to abolish, North Korean Ministry of Unification, as the Committee for Peaceful Reunification of the Fatherland. Also, they decided that they're going to abolish the Kumgan International Tourism Development Guidance Bureau and all related organizations. Plus, they indicated their willingness to withdraw from the Comprehensive Military Agreement. In a way, I mean, in the past few days, we also learned that the Japanese government decided not to allow foreigners to visit the Tokyo Olympic Games, which in the North Korean mind, they interpreted it, okay, there is no chance for any North-South contacts in Tokyo this summer. And basically, as a result, they realized that there was very little hope for any progress in the North-South relationship before the end of the Moon's administration term. So that was the second message. The third message came from Kim Jong-un himself, and that was in his correspondence with Xi Jinping just yesterday. He said, we are ready to strengthen the unity and coordination, policy coordination within the alliance, within the North Korean-Chinese alliance for the sake of solidarity against the hostile forces, which means the United States, of course, and South Korea, for the sake of development and prosperity. Not a single word about denuclearization. And the same message, by the way, he got from Xi Jinping in reply, in which Xi Jinping reiterated China's firm commitment to the defense of North Korea, basically saying not a single word about denuclearization and confirming that the Chinese was willing to stand firm with Pyongyang. Now, you look at what's happening in North Korea itself, all the recent personnel changes, the conclusion is that China hands are in ascendancy within the North Korean leadership bodies. Kim Son-nam, the China hand, longtime interpreter of Chinese language, the party official who handled China relations, he was promoted to the alternate member of the Politburo. The North Korean former foreign trade minister, Lee Ryong-nam, was appointed as ambassador to China. So again, the China party is mounting its influence in Pyongyang. So what are the implications of this? The implications are simple. Number one, North Korea expects very little positive from the Biden administration. And basically, its best wish is that the Biden people will ignore Korea for the next 4 years so that the North Koreans can do pretty much whatever they need to do with their WMD development programs. Number two, North Korea, especially you clearly see it in Kim Yo Jongs' statement, North Korea intends to marginalize the unification agenda. It's even willing to disband the unification apparatus, basically by absorbing various parts of it into the Foreign Ministry and the Ministry of Foreign Trade. And that's very significant. It's very significant. And number three, North Korea intends to lean increasingly on China and tighten its military security alliance with Beijing. And Beijing will gradually stop sanctions enforcement and probably even dismantle, the sanctions regime imposed on North Korea and increase its economic and diplomatic support for Pyongyang. Now, before I conclude, I'd like to make one more point, and that is about an idea, policy, one of the policy recommendations which was floating around Washington these days, and that is that in order to move ahead with our efforts to denuclearize North Korea, the United States should talk to its allies, Japan and South Korea, about possibly arming South Korea with nuclear weapons. I think it's a bad idea. It's an unhelpful idea. Arming South Korea with nuclear weapons against the threat of nuclear North Korea is counterproductive and short-sighted for 6 reasons. Number one, it will not stop North Korea from its nuclear breakout. Number two, on the opposite, it would further solidify North Korea's lock on nuclear weapons by taking away the high moral ground from the US demand that North Korea denuclearize. If anything, North Korea will argue if South Korea is allowed to have nuclear weapons, why should not North Korea be allowed to do the same? The third reason is that the nuclear arms race in the region will hurt the US security probably much more than just nuclear armed North Korea alone. Number four, transferring nuclear weapons to South Korea will damage US global non-proliferation, nuclear non-proliferation goals, and the US standing in the global nuclear non-proliferation regime. Number five, China itself might start proliferating nuclear weapons to other enemies of the United States, especially in the Middle East and other regions. And finally, the United States and its allies in the region, they have plenty of other, high precision, non-nuclear, high-power weapons which we can use to deter and defeat the North Korean nuclear threat. So the bottom line is, arming South Korea with nuclear weapons is a short-sighted, counterproductive, extremely provocative, irresponsible, and unhelpful proposal. And it should be basically killed before it gets any traction. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Dr. Manzaroff. It's excellent. Your insights always help us to see right to the core. And I know you are able to read the North Korean media as it breaks every day. So we're very grateful for your intervention here. This time we have a few questions. First, Joe Bermudez. Joe, where do you get your information when you are analyzing the North Korean military situation, and how is the Pentagon listening to your findings? How much do they respond?
Well, I can't give away all the secrets, can I? I've been working, I was dragged into North Korea in 1988, I think. So from 1988 to now, I've been studying North Korean defense intelligence affairs. During that time, I've built up a large network of colleagues and contacts, spoken to officials around the world concerning North Korea, acquired a large library. You can see part of it behind me, a very small part of it, by the way. We have at least 4 more units in my office here that are the same as behind me. Use the Freedom of Information Act at times. That's been helpful. And had the opportunity to meet with senior people who are concerned with North Korea throughout the world. So open source also plays a part in it, certainly. I also look at the North Korean media on a daily basis. That informs some things. So years of experience, that's where it really boils down to. As to how the Pentagon feels about it, I honestly never asked them or asked components of it. I know that my books and my writings are used regularly in the universities, the military universities here and abroad. So I guess it's reasonably well accepted.
Another question for you, Joe. Your words on the DPRK weaponry gives hope to many of us. What is the likelihood that they actually have a fully functional nuclear ICBM with the warhead properly attached by 50 bolts and all the way deliverable to impact?
An excellent question. If they don't have it, they're striving towards it. There's no doubt about that. The challenges here is they've demonstrated the capability to launch an ICBM class ballistic missile in a almost vertical orbit. Okay, so it reaches an apogee, the top of the flight envelope, that when you do the math, could actually reach the United States. The challenge with that is that you're flying it straight up and down as opposed to horizontally, or not horizontally, but in a circular orbit. You put different pressures on the airframe. Okay, and a nuclear warhead of the type most people believe North Korea has built is, I don't want to say it's a delicate thing, but it's not an extremely robust piece of technology. So when a ballistic missile takes off, it shakes violently. You've seen the pictures of astronauts going up in space launches, and you see how they're all shaking. Well, that warhead would shake also. And it's under tremendous G-forces coming down. Then the engine cuts off and the missile starts gliding, up into space. And you go from hot to cold, then you're coming back down, you start vibrating again, you experience tremendous heat. So whether the North Koreans have the capability to design a warhead that can withstand all those pressures is something we don't know, and they haven't demonstrated. And they haven't demonstrated a ICBM class ballistic missile that can go to the range but doesn't carry a nuclear weapon. If they put a dummy payload on it and launch it into the Southeast Pacific. They haven't demonstrated that. They have to really demonstrate those two things.
Thank you, Joe. For Bruce, question came in. How is the quality of the North Korean arms exports? Is it the customers they deal with? Do they have any choice? Are the North Koreans the only people that a lot of these countries can deal with? That's first question. We have a second one for you after that.
Okay. And I'd like to answer that. Before I get to that, I'd just like to comment on what Joe just said. There is, as many of your audience probably knows, considerable debate about re-entry. Can the third stage or second stage actually get through the Earth's atmosphere and with a nuclear payload and go to where it's supposed to go and destroy it, right? That still remains a big debate. So re-entry, and the second part is to boil down what he said, the second part of that is, can the nuclear weapon inside withstand all the G-forces and other things? Well, there's only one way that we're going to have an answer to that, because there are people at some think tanks that no matter what happens, no matter how good the missile looks or how bad it looks, they're going to say it'll never work. It'll never work. Just like with the Taepodong, it'll never work. The North Koreans can never build a three-stage missile or space launch vehicle from these old parts. Well, they did it. The only thing that's ever going to completely end that debate is when the North Koreans, or if the North Koreans decide to shoot the Hwasong 14 or 15 or whatever they develop that they decide to test live to some empty spot in the Indian Ocean, for example, or in the Pacific, with a nuclear warhead, and it explodes, and successfully. And then the North Koreans have told us, well, there you go. We told you we had a ballistic missile with a nuke, and there it is. And nobody wants them to get to that point. So back to the question you asked. You asked about the quality of the stuff that the North Koreans sell to their customers. Was that what you asked, Dr. Jenkins? Well, there's two parts to that. One is they sell their newer stuff, for lack of a better term, to Iran and Syria. For example, the North Koreans tested what they called the Hwasong-12, which is, many analysts think, comes from the RD-250 engine that the Ukrainians have, that they either stole, brought under the table, or got by accident. The Ukrainians are telling us, we didn't do anything. And of course, the North Koreans have it. So we know they did something, whether it was corrupt Ukrainians or not. But anyway, they got that engine and they built what they called the Hwasong-12. They launched that very successfully on May 13th, 2017. Why do I remember that date? Because that's also the day that my baby girl, the apple of my eye, the center of my life, graduated from the University of Iowa. Go Hawks! And they just a few months later, I don't want to oversimplify things, but used that Hwasong-12, elements of it, as the first stage for the Hwasong-14, and later the first stage for the Hwasong-15. They're ICBMs that Joe talked about, that they launched almost straight up in the air, and all that entails. They have sold these to Iran. So this is the top of the North Korean, at least the stuff we've seen demonstrated, the top of the North Korean ballistic missile, liquid ballistic missile development, and they're developing it for Iran. So, my good friend Tal Inbar, who some of you may know in Israel, he always says, but he stole it from me, if you see it in North Korea today, you see it in Iran tomorrow. And they developed naval craft for the Iranians. They sold those 170 millimeter long range artillery pieces. They've sold some of those to the Iranians, and of course their chemical weapons program they've sold to the Syrians and the Iranians. But the Iranians are essentially co-developing it, working with the Syrians on that. These are all the more high-end things, the things that cost the country you're proliferating to more money, because they're WMD and they cost more to develop, et cetera, et cetera. How good is the quality? Well, you heard Joe talking about the Musadon. It keeps blowing up on the pad, and after it takes off, the Iranians call it the Karam Shar. That's their version, and that one tends to blow up on the pad and blow up in the air and stuff a lot too. Some of their stuff is quite good though. Their submarines that they've sold them are quite good. Their artillery is quite good. So with conventional weapons, it goes pretty well. With ballistic missiles, for example, sometimes that goes well and sometimes it doesn't. And that's largely because they don't test them as much as many other countries do, as my friends could tell you. A lot of times they'll sell them. For example, they sold the Nodong to Iran after they had only tested it a couple of times. Got better, works better, but sometimes the quality is not as good. Now, the conventional weapon stuff that they sell to people like the Houthis and to the Syrian army and to every African country, it seems, on earth, but it's really about 11 to 13 countries right now, today, they're selling these things. That's like, the Type 70, I'm talking your former country's weapons, Sasha, so here we go. The Type 73 machine gun is their version of an SKS. Their Chunmaho tank is a version of the old Soviet, and I mean old, T-62 tanks. They've had those things a long time, like since the 60s and 70s. So they've had time to work on them and make them better and make them work pretty good. So there's not as many problems as you might anticipate because of the age of the systems and the fact that they've been manufacturing them for so.
Here's another question is.
To answer your question, that's sort of a mixed bag.
No, yeah, you mentioned 40% of their revenue is coming from illicit sales and illicit activity. And how much of that 40% would you estimate is from nuclear arms sales and the weaponry? Is that a major portion of the 40%?
The short answer is yes. Nuclear sales definitely to Syria, probably to Iran, based on anecdotal evidence. And, you know, it's $1.5 to $3 billion annually just to Iran and all its proxies in Syria and the Middle East. A couple of $100 million probably in Africa. So those are more annually than what they get from, for example, stealing stuff with their cyber warfare, selling counterfeit currency, you know, rhinoceros horns that they take illegally out of Africa. All that stuff is important and it brings in money for the regime, but they still make more money off arms sales in the billions annually.
Very good. Very good to understand. We've got about 20 countries that are joining in from Europe and all over the world here. One from Europe asks, how can European countries help intervene in Africa or the Middle East to block these arms sales? Or can the United States do more about it? What can be done, Bruce?
Well, the United States could do more about it. The European Union has been, our allies in the European Union have been very helpful. In fact, if you look at sanction readings and briefings on sanctions that, for example, RAND has produced, they really list three types of sanctions. The sanctions the U.S. and our close allies in Asia have, the UN sanctions, and the EU sanctions, because the EU has put some very important sanctions on the Middle East. And frankly, the key to this is enforcement. During the Obama administration and part of the Trump administration, we had great sanctions in, but they just weren't enforced very well. That can only be done. In fact, we will have failure if it's not done with our European allies and with our Asian allies. They are absolutely very necessary to get that accomplished. And that's something that I try to stress every time I talk about it.
Thank you. Dr. Manzaroff, a number of questions for each of you. We won't be able to get to all of them, but Dr. Manzaroff, could you elaborate a little bit on the statements of China and North Korea? They seem to be possibly propaganda statements to respond to the current Biden administration, that no mention of denuclearization will strengthen the alliance, and here we go. Could you elaborate a little bit more on that? And then also a question came from Europe that what about Japan? What role does Japan have in supporting the America and ROK versus China and North Korea?
Hey, thank you, Michael. And I hope the question on China, both Joe and Bruce will join me. Unfortunately, I think, you know, we saw the limits of the U.S. cooperation with China on the North Korea issue a few years ago. And I don't have much hope on China with respect to dealing with the North Korean nuclear issue. We crossed that bridge already. So if we shouldn't really count on China in helping us denuclearize the peninsula. If anything, we entered a new era of great powers rivalry, especially, you know, in the hot spots around the world. Northeast Asia is one of those regions where, you know, I expect the aggravation of tensions between the great powers, and you know, the countries in that region will be forced to take sides. I mean, we're tightening our alliances with South Korea and Japan. We're boosting Quad and its capabilities and kind of expanding its mission. So I expect the same thing to happen on the China, North Korea, Russia side. So that trilateral cooperation will be strengthened. We already see just the recent exchange of Chinese North Korean messages. Not only Xi Jinping and Kim Jong-un never mentioned denuclearization, both talked about solidarity, increasing solidarity against hostile forces, meaning the United States, boosting, China promised to boost North Korean capabilities, economic capabilities. So it would be good at the very least if the Chinese decide not to boost North Korean nuclear capabilities. Just like, we're talking about strengthening our deterrent capabilities in South Korea and Japan. Imagine if the Chinese begin to do the same in North Korea. And if they're going to basically try to augment North Korean ballistic missile and nuclear capabilities, just as we do with respect to our allies. On my own part, I regard North Korean WMD program as an extension of the Chinese second artillery, believe it or not, aimed at our enemies in the region. So again, I would basically stop counting on China as a country which will help us denuclearize North Korea. So we'll have to find a way to move that ball forward without reliance on China. Just like during the Cold War, I mean, we are seeing the reemergence of a new Cold War in the region, and so we have to recall, the practices which existed at that time. So that's number one. Number two, Bruce, I'd like to bring to your attention, I mean, you can talk more about it, about a successful way of deterring proliferation, especially nuclear proliferation, what we did in Al-Kibar, in Syria, when North Koreans, attempted to build a Jonguns-style nuclear power reactor in Al-Kibar in Syria. We worked together with our ally, Israel, basically to take out that capability. And that sent a powerful message to the North Koreans. Now, Proliferation Security Initiative is another way to kind of interdict the North Korean proliferation activities. And by the way, Bruce, one of the areas of concern to me is Myanmar, because in the wake of the military coup there, I expect essentially a reinvigoration of the military-to-military ties and military technical cooperation between North Korea and the military regime in Myanmar. They used to have very robust arms trade between the two countries, and I basically expect the same to resume. I'm sure you're going to agree with that. Also, I hope Joe and Bruce will agree that the new lineup of tactical missiles, KM-23, 24, 25, although we're worried about the ability to kind of carry nuclear warheads in the future and become a threat to our theater operations in the peninsula. But, in my opinion, the North Koreans are developing this lineup also for sales in the Middle East and other regions where there is a great demand for tactical missile capabilities. And so I wouldn't be surprised to see, the sales of KM 23, 24, 25 like missiles in the Libyan theater, in Yemen or in Syria one day, or in Iran.
Thank you, Alexander. This is great. We want to continue a little bit further with Joe. A question came in for you. Tom McDivitt, the chairman of the Washington Times, writes, China is still very essential, even though it's been clarified that it's about very little chance right now China's going to support the denuclearization effort actively. But Joe, do you have any thoughts on that? What would bring China back to the table to further sanctions or support U.S. initiative for denuclearization?
An excellent question. China is an interesting nation from many perspectives. It wants stability, but it also wants a certain level of instability. It wants to continue to grow economically. It wants to pursue its national interest by expanding in South China Seas and into the Eastern Pacific. And the US presents an issue for it. The North Korea problem keeps the United States busy. And the Chinese can just keep pushing along and, saying a few nice things, then doing something else, and keep that dynamic going. While the US is occupied, it can pursue its national goals. If North Korea were to become too, I don't even know the right word, too aggressive and threaten the plans of the Chinese government, then I could see more cooperation and more pressure from the Chinese. But there's so many variables in that equation. It's really hard to predict. They want North Korea to be that dog barking on the chain, but they don't want that dog loose.
Very good, very good. Bruce, any comments on this area of anything that would bring China back into supporting an initiative to hinder the nuclear weapons development in North Korea?
Oh, Sasha and I have argued about many things over beer and vodka for many years, but on China, and by the way, I really do respect his opinion a lot. He's a great scholar, but on China, I don't think I could agree more with him. I was just on CNBC. How's that for name dropping? About 5 days ago, and my good friend who was on that show, she used to work at Fox News, asked me, how would we work with China? How can we get them to help us with North Korea? And I probably talked too long and went through the history of how again and again presidential administrations in the United States, both Democrat and Republican, have counted on China to help us move North Korea. And it's never worked. They've always worked against us. And I think it's time. I hope that our allies understand this as well. I think it's time that we acknowledge any policy that we get done regarding North Korea and containing that threat is going to work despite what China does, because they don't see it in their national interest to do that. And by the way, if I may very quickly hit on what Sasha said about, because I've seen this in a lot of questions on the chat about stopping North Korea's illicit activities, particularly arms sales. I can tell you, in my opinion, and we've started this, we just need to push it harder. This started really under Trump more than anybody else. We need to, in Texas, we say, you want to kill the snake, you cut off the head. Larry knows that. So the thing in the head for the North Koreans is where all their dirty money's going. It's those front companies, it's those banks that they're running. And a good example of that is a guy that just got extradited from Malaysia. Malaysia has hundreds of front companies. So we need to work with our allies to do this, go after all these phony companies, these banks that are laundering North Korean money and getting rich off it. And we need to do that seriously. If we don't actually sanction banks, which we have done somewhat in the past, we need to do like what we did with the Iranians, which is fine banks. We fine Deutsche Bank millions of dollars. So that is something we can and should do right now, starting tomorrow. Will the present administration do that? That I do not know.
I'd like to just have some final remarks. Go ahead, Dr. Manzarov. We'd like to have 3 final remarks, 1 minute each. But Sasha, you go first, and I'll come back to you for your 1 minute remark. Go ahead.
I just wanted to say that cooperation with South Korea is critical. And what we saw during Secretary Blinken's visit and Austin's visit to Seoul last week is that it's not easy. I mean, the joint statement which we signed did not include any reference to denuclearization. We couldn't include the reference to human rights in North Korea. And we couldn't even mention China in that joint statement because of all the sensitivities which the current administration in Seoul has. in its blind pursuit of improving relations with the North. So unless we get, the South Koreans on the same page with us in our push for, human rights in North Korea, for denuclearization of North Korea, it will be really difficult to expect other allies, let alone China, to work hard towards our objectives on the peninsula. So again, the South Korean cooperation is a must, and they really have to come to grips with this reality that nuclear North Korea is a threat to them, to the South foremost, before it's a threat to anybody else. And unless they're willing to tackle that challenge head on, nothing will happen.
Quick final question, 1 minute each. Joe, what would you advise President Biden and the Biden administration to improve the situation with South Korea and North Korea denuclearization?
Well, I wish I had $1 million every time I was asked that question. I'd like to approach it somewhat differently. One of the challenges with US policy towards North Korea, and to a much lesser degree, South Korea, is that our policy changes with each administration. If somehow both sides could agree to a policy, a long-term policy, and pursue that over time across administrations, the likelihood is that we'd have more success than we've had with these alternating US administrations. And certainly that goes to North Korea, but to a lesser degree to South Korea and Japan. The Chinese leadership, the Russian leadership, extends across many US administrations. And every time we have a new administration, we have to redo this all again. And everybody has a better idea. To Bruce's point, I think with the foreign sales of weapons, and also our relations with the rest of the world, the way to get to North Korea, like Bruce had suggested, is through the banking system. It's simple as that. You bank with North Korea, you knowingly funnel money through them, launder money, you're going to be fine. We'll cut off business with you. The US is, US and China, largest economies in the world. Saying a bank can't do business with US companies is devastating to most of these organizations.
Very good. Right on time. Bruce?
I'll leave it to Bruce.
What kind of America?
I really like what both Sasha and Joe said. I feel obligated to say something really intelligent now, but I think it's important. Both Joe and Sasha brought up dealing with our allies. I think the biggest problem we have right now, and this is not on our side, it's on the ROK side. What I'm hearing, at least early on in the Biden administration's new evaluation of policy on North Korea, North and South Korea, is they are not planning on easing sanctions. They are planning on keeping the sanctions on. I think that's very important. And it includes things like what Joe just talked about, which is sanctioning or at least fining, which is a lesser step, banks and front companies that are laundering North Korean money. And that's a lot. That's billions a year. The problem with that is the current government in South Korea wants to ease sanctions. That's what they've been pushing us to do during the Trump administration, and they're still pushing the Biden administration to do that. I'm hoping that that doesn't have an effect on the Biden administrations because, and I truly believe this, the worst thing we could do in our policy, both as an alliance with South Korea and our policy vis-a-vis North Korea, is to ease sanctions. That would be a big mistake. And I'll just leave it there.
Thank you, Bruce. Alexander?
What do the North Koreans want us to do? Kim Yo-jong said, "Sleepy Joe, keep sleeping, if you want to sleep tight for the next 4 years." So my advice to the Biden administration be to do the opposite, engage North Korea. Instead of junking President Trump's summit diplomacy, engage North Korea full front at all levels, including the top level. And that way, instead of basically playing the strategic patience game again, giving North Koreans all the space to develop their WMD programs any way they want, that will put them in a straitjacket, will restrict their opportunities for mischief, and that will hopefully keep the ball rolling in the direction which we prefer and not what the North Koreans wants us to do, to sleep for the next 4 years, ignoring Korean Peninsula.
Well, I want to thank our panelists. This has been an excellent, excellent discussion and presentation. We thank you sincerely. Our founder, Dr. Hak Jahan Moon, is the founder of the Washington Times and also the co-founder of our sponsor here, UPF, Universal Peace Federation. She will be very comforted by the discussion today, as she's from North Korea and escaped before the Korean War. Larry, why don't you take us on to our next program? And I want to thank our panelists again. They deserve our thanks. And please go to Amazon and get the books from both Joe and Bruce. Let's call them out. Put them up on the screen one more time there, EJ. Let's put each book up on the screen. And we'd like to ask everybody, go to Amazon, get these books, because you'll learn a lot. You'll learn a lot. North Korean military proliferation in the Middle East and Africa was eye-opening today. Bruce Bechtol. And the next is, go ahead, bring the next cover on. The Armed Forces of North Korea by Joseph Bermudez Jr. Let's support their great efforts. Thank you. Larry, welcome.
Thank you very much, Dr. Mansaroff, Dr. Bermudez, and Dr. Bechtol. I look forward to coming back to West Texas sometime and taking a look at that fabled lake. We're grateful to have you. Next week, we're going to be taking a look from the media's perspective on covering Korea, covering China, covering these mysterious places where it's so hard to get reliable information, and they do it very well day in and day out. So it's going to be an exciting week, exciting webcast next week. So please join us at 2 p.m. next Tuesday. Thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone.
Goodbye, everybody. Drive safe, even though you're already at home.